The prison corridor was silent, only the buzz of the flickering lights overhead breaking the stillness. Behind the iron bars, a prisoner leaned forward, his eyes glinting with arrogance. "Is that all you've got, officer?" he sneered, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. Every inmate turned their head, waiting for the Texas female cop's reaction. She didn't answer. She just stood there, her hand resting on her belt, her gaze locked on him. The tension grew so heavy that even the guards nearby held their breath. And then, without warning, she moved. What she did next didn't just silence the prisoner. It shook the entire prison to its core. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The Huntsville unit in Texas had seen its share of tough inmates and tougher guards, but nobody was prepared for what happened on that sweltering August afternoon. Officer Maria Santos had been walking these corridors for 8 years, her boots echoing against the concrete floors with the confidence of someone who'd earned every ounce of respect she commanded. At 5'6", with steel gray eyes and a presence that could silence a room, Maria wasn't the kind of officer you tested. But Marcus "Tank" Williams didn't know that yet. Tank was everything the system had failed to fix. 6'4", 250 pounds of pure muscle and attitude, he'd been bouncing between juvenile detention and state prison since he was 14. Now 28, he wore his criminal record like armor, each conviction a badge of honor in his twisted world. Drug dealing, assault, armed robbery. The man had turned disrespect into an art form, and correctional officers were his favorite canvas. That Tuesday started like any other. The Texas heat was already climbing past 90 degrees by 9 in the morning, and the prison's ancient air conditioning system wheezed and groaned like a dying animal. Officer Santos was conducting her routine cell inspections in Block C, the maximum security wing where the worst of the worst called home. The inmates knew the drill. Stand back, hands visible, mouth shut. Most of them followed protocol. Tank had other plans. As Maria approached cell 47, she noticed the usual signs of trouble. The other prisoners had gone quiet, that particular kind of silence that meant someone was about to do something stupid. Tank was pacing his cell like a caged animal, his massive frame casting shadows against the gray walls. His cellmate, a smaller man named Rodriguez, had pressed himself into the far corner, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. "Morning inspection, Williams," Maria announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd handled situations like this countless times before. "Step to the back of your cell. Hands where I can see them." Tank stopped pacing and turned toward the bars with a grin that made Maria's instincts flare. She'd seen that look before. It was the expression of a man who thought he'd found an easy target, someone he could intimidate to boost his reputation among the other inmates. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Well, Tank drawled, his voice dripping with mock respect. "If it isn't Officer Barbie, tell me, sweetheart, when do the real cops show up for inspection?" The corridor fell dead silent. Even the constant background noise of the prison seemed to fade away. The other inmates pressed against their bars, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Some of them had been here long enough to know Officer Santos's reputation, and they were already shaking their heads at Tank's monumental mistake. Maria didn't flinch. She'd heard every insult, every crude comment, every attempt to diminish her authority over the years. But there was something different about this moment. Something in Tank's eyes that told her he wasn't just testing boundaries. He was declaring war. "Last warning, Williams," she said, her voice steady as granite. "Step back and assume the position." Tank laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Or what, little lady? You gonna write me up? Maybe call for backup because you can't handle a real man." That's when he made his fatal mistake. Instead of stepping back, Tank pressed himself against the bars, his face inches from Maria's. His breath reeked of the cheap coffee and processed food that passed for meals in the prison cafeteria. "Let me tell you something, officer," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "I've been locked up since before you were probably even thinking about playing dress-up in that uniform. You don't scare me. Matter of fact, you don't belong here. This is a man's world, and you're just a pretty face trying to play tough. Why don't you run along and find yourself a nice desk job somewhere? Maybe answer phones or make coffee for the real officers." The insults kept coming, each one more vile than the last. Tank's voice grew louder, more aggressive, as he sensed what he thought was weakness in Maria's calm response. He started describing in graphic detail what he thought she should be doing instead of working in corrections, his words becoming increasingly vulgar and personal. But Maria just stood there, her expression never changing, her hand resting calmly on her belt. She'd learned long ago that the loudest voices usually belong to the most insecure people, and Tank Williams was proving that theory in spectacular fashion. What Tank didn't know, what none of the newer inmates realized, was that Officer Maria Santos wasn't just any correctional officer. Before joining the Department of Criminal Justice, she'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a military police officer. She dealt with insurgents, riots, and situations that would make Tank's worst day look like a walk in the park. More importantly, she'd earned the respect of every veteran officer in the facility through actions, not words. The other inmates who'd been around longer were watching this confrontation with a mixture of fascination and dread. They knew what Tank didn't. They'd seen Maria handle situations that had broken other officers. They'd watched her earn her place in one of the toughest prisons in Texas through sheer competence and unbreakable will. Some of them were already whispering warnings to Tank, but his voice was too loud, his ego too inflated to hear them. As Tank continued his tirade, describing what he thought Maria's place should be in the world, something shifted in the atmosphere of Block C. The temperature seemed to drop despite the oppressive Texas heat. Even the air itself felt charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Maria's hand moved slightly on her belt, and every experienced inmate in the block recognized the sign. Officer Santos was about to remind everyone why she'd never lost a confrontation in 8 years of corrections work. Tank Williams was about to get an education he'd never forget. The veteran inmates knew the signs. When Officer Santos went completely still like that, when her breathing became measured and controlled, when that particular look entered her steel-gray eyes, something was about to happen. Tank Williams was still running his mouth, oblivious to the fact that he'd just crossed a line that nobody in Block C had ever dared approach. "You hearing me, sweetheart?" Tank continued, pressing his face closer to the bars. "I said you don't belong here. This uniform's too big for you. Maybe you should stick to directing traffic or checking IDs at some shopping mall." That's when Maria finally spoke, her voice so quiet that Tank had to strain to hear her. "Williams, I'm going to give you one more chance to step back and show some respect. Not because I need you to, but because it's your last opportunity to handle this the easy way." Tank threw his head back and laughed, a sound that carried down the entire corridor. "The easy way? Lady, you got it twisted. I've been doing hard time since you were probably still playing with dolls. You think you can intimidate me? I eat little girls like you for breakfast." The insults grew worse. Tank started describing what he thought Maria should be doing with her life, his words becoming increasingly crude and personal. He talked about how women didn't belong in corrections, how they were too weak, too emotional, too soft to handle real criminals. Each word was calculated to humiliate, to break down her professional composure and reduce her to tears. But Maria Santos had heard it all before. During her military service, she'd faced down insurgents who'd tried to use similar tactics. She'd walked through hostile territory where one moment of weakness could mean death. She'd earned her sergeant's stripes by proving that respect wasn't given based on gender. It was earned through actions and competence. What Tank didn't realize was that every word he spoke was being heard by inmates who'd already learned to respect Officer Santos the hard way. Carlos Martinez, in cell 43, had tried to rush her during his first week. He'd spent 3 days in solitary and came out with a completely different attitude. Tommy Red Johnson in cell 45 had once thrown his food tray at her during a particularly bad day. Maria had handled that situation so professionally, yet firmly, that Red now greeted her politely every morning. But Tank was new. He'd been transferred from a medium security facility upstate just 2 weeks ago, and he hadn't yet learned the unwritten rules of Block C. He thought his size and his reputation would carry him here just like they had everywhere else. He was about to discover that the Huntsville unit operated by different rules entirely. "I'm waiting for an answer, Officer Barbie," Tank sneered, gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles went white. "When are you gonna admit you're in over your head? When are you gonna run crying to your supervisor and ask for a transfer to somewhere more suitable for delicate little flowers like yourself?" The other inmates were getting restless now. Some of them genuinely liked Officer Santos and didn't appreciate watching her get disrespected by someone who hadn't earned the right to challenge her authority. Others were simply tired of Tank's constant need for attention and drama. A few were placing quiet bets on how this would end, though the smart money was all on the same outcome. Maria took a step closer to the cell, close enough that Tank could see his reflection in her sunglasses. Her voice remained perfectly calm, but there was something underneath it now, something that made the hair on the back of every inmate's neck stand up. "Williams, you've been here 2 weeks, and in that time, you've managed to accumulate more disciplinary reports than some inmates get in 2 years. You've disrespected every officer on this block, started fights with your cellmates, and now you're standing here trying to intimidate me because you think being bigger makes you stronger." Tank's grin faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Damn right it does. Size matters in here, little girl. You can't handle someone like me. Is that what you think?" Maria asked, her tone almost conversational. "You think this is about physical size? I know it is. You're what, maybe 140 soaking wet? I could break you in half without breaking a sweat." That's when Maria smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of expression that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Several inmates who'd been watching through their cell bars suddenly found other things to occupy their attention. "Williams, I want you to look around this block," Maria said, her voice carrying clearly to every cell. "Take a good look at the faces watching you right now. See that man in cell 41? That's Jerome Washington. He's serving life for killing 2 men with his bare hands during a bar fight. The guy in cell 46 is Marcus Thompson. He put 3 police officers in the hospital during his arrest." Tank's eyes darted around the corridor, suddenly noticing that none of the other inmates were backing him up. In fact, most of them were shaking their heads or looking away entirely. "Every single man on this block has tried to test me at some point," Maria continued. "Some of them tried intimidation. Some tried manipulation. A few even tried violence. Want to know what they all learned?" Tank's bravado was starting to crack, but he was too committed to back down now. "Yeah? What's that?" "They learned that respect isn't about size, Williams. It's not about how loud you can yell or how many push-ups you can do. It's about competence, consistency, and the ability to back up your authority when it's challenged." The corridor had gone completely silent now. Even the usual background noise of the prison seemed muted, as if the entire facility was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Maria reached for her radio, and Tank tensed, thinking she was calling for backup. Instead, she turned the volume down and clipped it back to her belt. "I'm not calling for help, Williams. I don't need it. What I'm going to do is give you a choice. You can step back, apologize for your disrespectful behavior, and we can pretend this conversation never happened. Or you can keep running your mouth, and I'll show you exactly why every inmate in this block treats me with respect." Tank looked around desperately, searching for support from his fellow inmates. Instead, he found faces turned away, men who'd learned the hard way not to underestimate the quiet woman in the correctional officer's uniform. But Tank Williams wasn't the type to back down. His pride had carried him this far, and in his twisted logic, backing down now would destroy whatever reputation he thought he'd built. The sweat beading on his forehead wasn't from the Texas heat anymore. It was from the dawning realization that he might have bitten off more than he could chew. "You think you scare me?" Tank said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "I've been locked up with killers, cartel members, gang leaders. What makes you think one little female cop is gonna make me shake in my boots?" Maria nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that response. "Williams, let me tell you a story. 3 years ago, we had an inmate named Big Mike Patterson, 6'8", 300 pounds of pure muscle, former heavyweight boxer who'd killed a man in the ring and 2 more on the street. He thought just like you do." The other inmates were listening intently now. Some of them remembered Big Mike, and their expressions told Tank everything he needed to know about how that story ended. "Mike decided he was going to make an example out of me," Maria continued, her voice steady and calm. "Figured if he could humiliate the female officer, he'd be the king of the block. Sound familiar?" Tank's grip on the bars loosened slightly, but his mouth kept running. "Yeah? So what happened to Big Mike?" "He's currently in the psychiatric wing at the Polunsky unit. Turns out, when you underestimate someone based on their size or gender, you might just find yourself completely unprepared for what they're actually capable of." The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop another few degrees. Tank looked around desperately, finally noticing that Rodriguez, his own cellmate, had moved as far away from him as possible. The smaller man was pressed against the back wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Rodriguez knows, don't you, Rodriguez?" Maria called out. "Tell Williams what you told me yesterday when you requested a cell transfer." Rodriguez swallowed hard, clearly not wanting to get involved but knowing he had no choice. "I told her you were trouble, man. I told her you were going to do something stupid and get us both in lockdown." Tank spun around to face his cellmate. "You ratted me out? You little piece of—" "I didn't rat nobody out," Rodriguez shot back, finding some courage now that Officer Santos was present. "I just ain't stupid enough to think size matters more than brains in here. You've been here 2 weeks and already got 3 write-ups. I've been here 2 years without a single incident report." Maria stepped closer to the cell, close enough that Tank could smell her perfume mixed with the standard issue equipment soap. "Rodriguez is smart, Williams. He understands something you haven't figured out yet. This isn't the street. This isn't some bar where you can throw your weight around and intimidate people. This is a controlled environment where intelligence and training matter more than bench press numbers." Tank's face was flushing red now, a combination of anger and embarrassment. The other inmates were openly staring, some of them starting to murmur among themselves. In prison, being dressed down by a guard was bad enough. Being dressed down by a female guard in front of the entire block was social suicide. "You done running your mouth, officer?" Tank snarled. "Because I got things to say too." "I'm sure you do," Maria replied. "But before you say them, let me ask you something. Do you know why they transferred you here from Eastham Unit?" Tank's expression faltered. That wasn't a question he'd expected, and the answer wasn't one he wanted to share with the entire block. "They didn't tell me nothing about why. They told me plenty," Maria interrupted, pulling a folder from her belt. "Says here you assaulted a correctional officer. Female officer, as a matter of fact. Officer Rebecca Martinez. Ring a bell?" The corridor went dead silent. Every inmate knew that assaulting a guard was one of the worst things you could do in the system. It meant automatic time in solitary additional charges and a reputation that followed you wherever you went. Tank's face went pale. "That ain't what happened. She was doing her job, just like I'm doing mine," Maria said firmly. "And according to this report, you thought your size gave you the right to put your hands on her. Spent 6 months in the hole for that little mistake, didn't you?" The other inmates were backing away from their cell doors now. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who had a history of assaulting female officers. It was a line that even the hardest criminals rarely crossed. "The difference is," Maria continued, "Officer Martinez was a rookie, 22 years old, fresh out of the academy, first week on the job, she wasn't prepared for someone like you. Tank's breathing was getting heavier, his massive chest rising and falling rapidly. So what's your point? My point is that I'm not Officer Martinez. I'm not 22, I'm not a rookie, and I'm not unprepared. Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow every word carried clearly through the corridor. I've been waiting for someone like you, Williams. Someone who thinks they can intimidate me because I'm a woman. Someone who confuses kindness with weakness and respect with fear. She reached for her belt again, but this time she wasn't going for her radio. Her hand rested on something else entirely, something that made Tank's eyes widen with sudden understanding. You see, Williams, there's something about my background that isn't in your file. Something that the administration doesn't advertise, but every smart inmate figures out pretty quickly. The veteran inmates were nodding now, finally understanding where this was heading. Carlos Martinez in cell 43 started shaking his head and muttering under his breath, "Man, you done messed up now. You really done messed up." "What are you talking about?" Tank demanded. Though his voice had lost most of its aggressive edge, Maria smiled that same unpleasant smile from before. "Before I became a correctional officer, Williams, I spent 8 years in the military. Not behind a desk, not in some safe office somewhere. I was military police in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, places where showing weakness for even a second could get you and your entire unit killed." Tank's grip on the bars was white-knuckled now, his body language shifting from aggressive to defensive. "I've dealt with insurgents who made you look like a choir boy. I've handled riots that would make your worst day in general population look like a Sunday picnic. I've been shot at, bombed, threatened, and attacked by people who made careers out of violence." The corridor was so quiet now that you could hear the individual drips from the leaky pipe 3 cells down. Every inmate was pressed against their bars, watching this confrontation unfold with the fascination of spectators at a gladiator match. "But you know what the real difference is between those insurgents and you, Williams?" Maria asked, taking another step closer to the cell. "What?" Tank whispered. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. They were fighting for something they believed in. They had a cause, a purpose, something bigger than themselves. You're just a bully who never learned that the world doesn't revolve around your insecurities. Tank's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely speechless. The woman standing in front of his cell had just systematically dismantled every assumption he'd made about her, every strategy he'd planned to use against her. "Now," Maria continued, her voice returning to its normal professional tone, "I'm going to give you one last chance to step back, apologize for your disrespectful behavior, and accept your punishment like a man. Or I can show you exactly what 8 years of military training looks like when applied to civilian corrections." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Tank looked around the corridor one more time, searching for any sign of support, any indication that someone would back him up if this situation escalated further. Instead, he found faces turned away, inmates who'd suddenly discovered intense interest in their cell walls, their books, anything that would keep them from making eye contact with either Tank or Officer Santos. Jerome Washington in cell 41, the lifer who'd killed 2 men with his bare hands, caught Tank's eye for just a moment. The look on his face said everything Tank needed to know. Even the most dangerous men in Block C knew better than to test Officer Santos. Tank's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation finally hit him. He wasn't in some medium security facility anymore where his reputation and size could carry him through any confrontation. He was in maximum security, surrounded by men who'd learned through hard experience that respect was earned, not demanded. "I'm waiting for an answer, Williams," Maria said quietly. "And I should mention that every word of this conversation is being recorded by the security cameras. So whatever happens next, there will be a very clear record of who escalated this situation and who chose to resolve it peacefully." Tank looked up at the cameras he'd forgotten about, small black domes mounted at regular intervals along the corridor ceiling. His every word, every gesture, every moment of disrespect had been captured in high definition. Any complaint he might file later would be immediately contradicted by video evidence. The walls were closing in, metaphorically and literally. Tank Williams, who'd spent his entire adult life using intimidation and violence to solve his problems, was facing a situation that couldn't be resolved with either. He was facing a professional who'd outmaneuvered him completely, using nothing more than knowledge, experience, and unshakable confidence. "Officer Santos," Tank said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'm listening, Williams. I want to apologize for the disrespect, for the language, for everything." The admission seemed to echo through the corridor like thunder. Several inmates let out long-held breaths, the tension finally starting to dissipate. But Maria wasn't finished yet. "Apology noted, Williams. But apologies without consequences are just empty words. You're going to spend the next 72 hours in administrative segregation while we decide how to handle this situation properly." Tank nodded, knowing he was getting off easier than he deserved. "Yes, ma'am." "And Williams?" "Yes, ma'am. When you get back to general population, I expect you to remember this conversation every time you see me walking these corridors. Respect isn't optional in my prison. It's mandatory." The word "my" hung in the air with unmistakable authority. Every inmate in Block C understood exactly what Officer Santos meant. This was her domain, these were her rules, and anyone who forgot that would be reminded in ways they wouldn't soon forget. As Maria turned to leave, calling for the segregation team over her radio, Tank Williams slumped against the back wall of his cell. In the span of 15 minutes, he'd learned more about power, respect, and authority than he'd understood in his entire criminal career. But the story was far from over. What happened next would transform not just Tank Williams, but the entire culture of Block C in ways nobody could have predicted. The segregation team arrived within minutes, their heavy boots echoing through the now silent corridor. Tank Williams didn't resist as they cuffed him and led him away to administrative segregation. His head was down, his earlier swagger completely gone. As the steel door clanged shut behind him, the other inmates began to whisper among themselves, processing what they'd just witnessed. But Officer Santos wasn't done. She had one more move that would change everything. 3 days later, Tank sat alone in his segregation cell, staring at the blank concrete walls. No books, no television, no contact with other inmates, just silence and his own thoughts. He'd had plenty of time to replay that confrontation in his mind, and each time he did, he realized how completely he'd misread the situation. On the morning of the 4th day, his cell door opened. Tank expected to see guards coming to escort him back to general population. Instead, Officer Santos walked in alone, carrying a small folding chair and a manila folder. "Good morning, Williams," she said, setting up the chair across from his narrow bunk. "We need to talk." Tank sat up, immediately on guard. In his experience, when guards wanted to talk privately, it usually meant more trouble. "Am I in more trouble, Officer Santos?" "That depends entirely on you," Maria replied, settling into her chair with the same calm confidence she'd displayed during their corridor confrontation. "I've been reviewing your file, Williams. Your entire file, not just the incident reports." She opened the manila folder, revealing pages of documents Tank had never seen before. His juvenile records, psychological evaluations, family history, educational background, his entire life laid out in bureaucratic detail. "Says here you were actually a decent student until you turned 14. Honor roll, even made varsity football as a freshman. Then something changed. Your grades dropped. You started getting in fights, running with the wrong crowd. What happened, Tank?" The question caught him off guard. Nobody had asked him that in years. Most people just saw the criminal record and made their assumptions. "I don't see what that's got to do with anything." "Humor me," Maria said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "I've got time." Tank stared at his hands, memories flooding back. "My dad left. Just up and disappeared one day when I was 14. Mom started drinking, lost her job, lost the house. I had to drop out of school to work, help pay the bills. Football didn't matter anymore when we were about to be homeless. Maria nodded, making notes in the folder. And the first arrest was for shoplifting food. Yeah, Mom was passed out drunk and my little sister was hungry. I took some bread and peanut butter from the corner store. Got caught, got arrested, got labeled as a thief. Tank's voice was bitter, but there was something else there too. Pain, maybe. Regret. Your sister, Rebecca, she's 24 now, works as a nurse in Dallas. Clean record, college degree, married with 2 kids. You know she visits about you? Tank's Hea the prison administration office every 6 months asking snapped up. What? No, she doesn't. She hasn't spoken to me in 5 years. She writes letters. Administration never delivers them because you're classified as a violent offender with restrictions on family contact. But she writes them anyway, every month, like clockwork. Maria pulled out a stack of envelopes from the folder. Tank's name was written on each one in careful handwriting he recognized immediately. His hands shook as he reached for them. She still believes in you, Williams. Even after everything you've done, every time you've disappointed her, she still thinks there's good in you worth saving. Tank's eyes filled with tears as he held the letters. 14 years of crime, violence, and self-destruction, and his baby sister still cared enough to write. Why are you showing me this? He whispered. Because I don't think you're really a bad person, Tank. I think you're a scared 14-year-old kid who never learned how to deal with abandonment and trauma. You've been angry at the world for so long that anger became your identity. Maria leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. But anger isn't strength, Williams. Real strength is admitting when you're wrong, facing your pain instead of inflicting it on others, and choosing to be better even when it's harder than staying the same. Tank Williams returned to Block C a changed man. The letters from his sister had opened something inside him that years of violence had sealed shut. He apologized to Rodriguez, started attending anger management classes, and began working toward his GED. Officer Santos had shown him something more powerful than intimidation or brute force. She'd shown him compassion without compromising her authority. Within 6 months, Tank became one of the most respected inmates in the facility, not through fear, but through genuine transformation. He started mentoring younger inmates, sharing his story as a warning about the path of violence and disrespect. Other officers began requesting Tank's help in de-escalating situations with difficult prisoners. Officer Santos continued her rounds with the same quiet confidence, but now she carried something extra. The knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous inmates just need someone to see past their anger to the pain underneath. She'd learned that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about knowing when to stand firm and when to extend a hand. The prison administration took notice. Maria's approach became a model for de-escalation training throughout the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Her combination of military discipline and human compassion proved that respect earned through understanding lasts longer than fear imposed through force. But perhaps the most powerful change happened in Block C itself. The other inmates watched Tank's transformation and began to question their own attitudes toward authority and respect. Incident reports dropped by 60% over the following year. The culture of the entire block shifted from one of constant confrontation to grudging cooperation. Tank eventually earned his GED, then his associate's degree through the prison's education program. Officer Santos was there the day he graduated, standing in the back of the small ceremony with a smile that said more than any words could express. She'd seen past the angry giant to the hurt teenager underneath, and that vision had saved not just one man, but an entire community. Years later, when Tank was finally released on parole, the first person he called wasn't his lawyer or his parole officer. It was his sister, Rebecca. The second call was to Officer Santos, thanking her for seeing something in him that he'd forgotten existed. The lesson echoed through every corridor of the Huntsville unit long after Tank Williams walked free. Respect isn't taken, it's earned. Strength isn't about size or volume. It's about character and consistency. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is show someone that they're worth more than their worst moment. Officer Maria Santos proved that day that true authority doesn't come from a uniform or a badge. It comes from the courage to stand firm when tested, the wisdom to see beyond the surface, and the compassion to believe in redemption even when others have given up hope. She didn't just control a prison block that day. She changed lives, including her own. That's the power of respect, earned the hard way and given freely when it matters most.